The USS Scorpion was one of only 2 nuclear submarines ever lost by the U.S. Navy.
For decades, the official story has been a lie. 99 men vanished into the crushing blackness of the ocean abyss aboard the USS Scorpion, and the world was told it was just an accident.
When it comes to why the Scorpion sank, there is no shortage of theories that claim to explain it.
But a silence this deep often hides the darkest secrets. Now, in 2025, the Iron Curtain of deception is finally tearing open. New evidence has surfaced, proving the truth was not just another underwater disaster, but something far worse than any nightmare we imagined.
Submariners are extremely reliable. When a submariner says, I'm going to be at a place at a certain time, they're either dead or they're there.
And once these pieces snap into place, the truth stops looking accidental at all. Prepare for the dark truth that has been hidden for decades. The call that reopened a case the Navy had intentionally buried. The case did not reopen because new wreckage was found, or because technology suddenly improved. It reopened because someone said the forbidden part out loud. Someone big and public stated a simple technical problem that had been quietly avoided for decades. The Navy's explanation for the loss of USS Scorpion could not physically produce the acoustic signatures, structural damage patterns, and disappearance timeline recorded the night the submarine vanished.
The nuclear attack submarine, USS Scorpion, SSN 589, has been reported overdue at Norfolk.
That statement did not introduce new data, but exposed a contradiction that had already been sitting inside classified files since 1968. And once spoken publicly, it could not be pushed back into silence. That public figure was Tucker Carlson. When Carlson accused the Navy of suppressing the truth, the power of the claim was not outrage. It was alignment. His words matched what families had been saying since the first memorial services, what submarine veterans whispered in closed rooms, and what internal Navy documents never fully reconciled. These pieces had always existed, but they were deliberately separated. No single forum was ever allowed to assemble them into one continuous explanation. The accusation worked because it reconnected fragments that had been isolated by design. The 2012 petition by U.S. submarine veterans mattered for one reason the Navy never addressed. These were not outsiders speculating from newspaper clippings, but operators trained to interpret underwater sound profiles, pressure hull failures, and engagement acoustics. They understood what an internal malfunction sounds like and what an external event sounds like. Thus, their request to reopen the investigation was not political but technical. But the Navy rejected it anyway. No counter-analysis was released, and no alternative model was published. The rejection contained no argument, only finality. That response exposed something critical. The Navy did not defend its conclusion about what happened to the USS Scorpion. It only defended its authority to prevent reevaluation. In legitimate accident investigations, evidence is used to defeat doubt. But in this case, doubt itself was treated as the threat. The refusal signaled that reopening the case was unacceptable, regardless of what might be found. That is not how resolved incidents are handled, but how contained events are protected. Families noticed the shift immediately. If the Navy would not allow reevaluation inside U.S. jurisdiction, they would move the question outside it. Plans were announced to pursue independent investigation under international waters, where domestic authority could not automatically shut the effort down. This new context quietly shattered the official framing of the Scorpion's sinking. It was no longer viewed as a mere machine failure.
It's overdue in high seas. The USS Scorpion with 99 aboard last contacted May the 21st.
But an event where the accepted story had not endured because it was true, but because it had been ruthlessly shielded from competition with any alternative explanation. With this realization, one terrifying conclusion became unavoidable. The submarine's disappearance only made sense if something other than an accident had happened to the Scorpion, and that meant that the sub had not been operating in those waters alone that fateful day. The disappearance that only makes sense if the submarine was not alone. USS Scorpion vanished in May 1968 while doing something submarines did thousands of times without incident, returning home. She was not on a combat patrol or conducting any weapons tests. She was not ordered to dive beyond design limits or run experimental systems. Her route back to Norfolk was routine and well within operational norms. That single fact quietly destroys many of the explanations later offered. Catastrophic failures do not usually strike without warning during low-risk transits unless something sudden and external intervenes. What followed made the situation even harder to explain. There was no distress call, no emergency broadcast, no coded warning, warning, and no release of the emergency buoy designed to surface automatically if the crew lost control. Submarine crews are trained to report even minor anomalies because time is survival. The complete silence meant one thing: whatever happened unfolded faster than trained operators could react. This was not a slow systems failure or a chain of manageable problems. It was an initiating event that overwhelmed human response immediately. That reality was already known on the night Scorpion disappeared because the ocean itself recorded it. Deep beneath the Atlantic, classified SOSUS hydrophone arrays detected a sharp acoustic spike, followed by a sequence of distinct collapse noises. This pattern mattered because internal malfunctions produce chaotic, drawn-out sound profiles. This means that fires, battery explosions, and mechanical failures escalate over time. But what SOSUS recorded was different. One sudden violent event came first, then the hull collapse came after. That order tells a story the official explanation never addressed. Instead of releasing the data, it was classified immediately. Analysts outside the Navy were never allowed to examine the acoustic signatures or compare them with known weapon effects or collision profiles. The justification was national security, but the classification had a side effect that was never acknowledged. It prevented anyone from proving that the sound did not match an external strike. That uncertainty was preserved by design. Then came the search. Publicly, the Navy described it as a difficult hunt across vast ocean space. Privately, search assets converged with unsettling accuracy. The wreck was located not through random sweeping, but near where acoustic data already pointed. That precision raised an obvious question. How did they know where to look so quickly if the cause and location were truly unknown? As the days passed, the public heard one message repeatedly: there was not enough information to draw conclusions. Yet classified systems had already produced exact timelines, depth estimates, and collapse sequences. The Navy knew when Scorpion was lost, they knew roughly where, and they knew the order in which the submarine died. What they did not share was why that sequence mattered. This split between private certainty and public ambiguity was not a mistake. It became the structure of the narrative that followed. By acknowledging confusion publicly while maintaining clarity internally, the Navy avoided questions it did not want asked. No external force could be examined if the initiating event was never defined. Once that pattern is recognized, the disappearance stops looking mysterious. It starts looking managed, and that realization forces the next question into focus. What happened after the loss was already understood, but before the story was written? Investigations that documented evidence while preventing synthesis. The first investigation began in 1968, almost immediately after the Navy accepted that USS Scorpion was gone. On paper, it was a court of inquiry tasked with finding the cause. In reality, it functioned as a containment exercise. The court listed multiple possible failure scenarios, from mechanical issues to weapon malfunction to flooding, but made a critical procedural decision that shaped everything that followed. It refused to rank any cause by likelihood. By treating every explanation as equally plausible, the inquiry avoided committing to any single chain of events, preserving ambiguity instead of resolving it. That choice mattered. Investigations are designed to narrow outcomes, not expand them. Yet this one produced a menu of explanations without weighing evidence against probability. The effect was subtle but powerful. No theory could be challenged as weaker than another because none had been elevated as stronger. The report appeared thorough while functionally concluding nothing. This was not a failure of analysis, but a method of freezing the narrative. In 1970, the Naval Ordnance Laboratory released its own report, focusing specifically on torpedoes. This should have been decisive, as if a weapon malfunction had caused the loss, the acoustic record would show it. The Navy had that record as SOSUS had captured the event. Yet the report examined torpedo behavior in isolation, deliberately excluding integration with classified acoustic data. Without that comparison, internal detonation scenarios could never be conclusively ruled out, even though such integration could have eliminated them in a single step. This was not an oversight but compartmentalization. One set of analysts studied weapons while another controlled acoustic intelligence. The two were never allowed to meet on paper, and the result was a permanent gap where conclusions should have formed. Visual evidence followed the same pattern. Deep-sea photographs taken in 1968 and later in 1985 showed hull fractures, collapsed sections, and debris fields. But they were released stripped of context with no orientation data, no reference angles, and no comparative analysis with known implosion or explosion damage. Viewers could see destruction, but not interpret it. The images informed the public just enough to satisfy curiosity while denying the information required to draw conclusions. The Navy disclosed the wreck's coordinates and depth, presenting transparency, but withheld full structural surveys that could have mapped damage progression across the hull. This created visibility without interpretability. The wreck could be acknowledged without being understood. Even more revealing was what happened after the case was supposedly closed. The Navy returned to the site periodically to monitor radiation leakage from the reactor and nuclear weapons. This required resources, planning, and continued classification. A closed case does not receive recurring strategic attention, but an unresolved one does. Each investigation gathered facts, logged data, and archived findings, but what none of them were allowed to do was assemble those facts into a single causal chain. The information was real, and the silence was deliberate to ensure that no single document could ever force a conclusion the Navy did not want to defend. And into that engineered gap, theories rushed in to fill the void. Theories that explained everything except the evidence. Once the Navy sealed the investigation files, explanations were allowed to circulate, but only the kind that kept blame inside the submarine. Over time, a familiar pattern emerged. Each theory focused on a single internal failure, treated in isolation while ignoring any evidence that did not fit. What looked like open inquiry now flooded the public space with possibilities that never had to be matched with classified data. The battery hydrogen explosion theory became one of the earliest favorites. On paper, it sounded technical and harmless. Hydrogen gas could build up during battery charging, ignite, and trigger catastrophe. But this mechanism required time and warning signs like voltage irregularities, abnormal heat readings, internal alarms, or crew reports of battery issues. USS Scorpion transmitted none of these. She remained in normal contact range until moments before vanishing. A slow-building internal hazard does not erase a submarine without leaving a trail of escalating distress. That contradiction was never addressed publicly. Next came the accidental torpedo activation theory. This explanation relied on the idea that a Mark 37 torpedo somehow armed itself inside the tube, but the Mark 37 was designed with multiple independent safety interlocks. These systems were not redundant copies of the same mechanism, but different safeguards meant to fail separately. For an accidental activation to occur, at least 3 independent systems would have had to fail at the same time, without triggering alarms or automatic shutdowns, and without crew intervention. Yet to date, the Navy never released a statistical assessment of that probability. It simply allowed the idea to linger. Then there was the intentional torpedo firing theory. This one placed responsibility squarely on the crew, implying a catastrophic decision under pressure. But Scorpion was not on a combat patrol. She was returning home. There was no declared threat, no engagement order, and no tactical reason to arm or launch a live weapon in open ocean. This theory required an unexplained shift in crew behavior that violated standing orders and training. The Navy never explained why seasoned officers would do this without provocation. Structural failure theories followed, pointing to hull fatigue and depth limitations. These explanations leaned on abstract engineering limits rather than event data. Yet SOSUS recordings showed a single sharp acoustic spike, followed by rapid implosion. Hull fatigue produces progressive noise signatures in the form of creaks, pops, and sequential collapses, not a sudden initiating shock. This discrepancy is always buried in technical language and never explained to the public. One of the most shocking explanations involved the trash disposal unit. According to this theory, seawater entered through the system, reacted with batteries, and caused an explosion. But for this to happen, the crew would have had to misinterpret alarms, fail to isolate compartments, ignore escalating failures, and remain completely silent throughout. This behavior contradicts submarine emergency doctrine, which prioritizes immediate reporting and containment. The theory survived not because it made sense, but because it pointed inward. Every one of these explanations shared a common flaw. They addressed internal mechanisms in isolation while avoiding integration with SOS-US data that recorded an abrupt, violent acoustic event inconsistent with gradual internal failure. That data existed, but it was classified, and without it, no theory could be definitively disproven. The result was not clarity, but saturation. There were too many explanations, yet none were complete. Each plausible on its own, and still they all collapsed when placed beside the full evidence set. But what many began to suspect was that this was not confusion by accident, but confusion by design. And that design only began to unravel when something the Navy never expected to surface finally did. The 2025 leak that changed the question entirely. In 2025, the narrative finally broke, not because the Navy chose transparency, but because internal correspondence slipped out of containment. These documents showed that naval intelligence had flagged anomalous underwater contacts in the exact grid USS Scorpion entered during her final transit. These were not passive sonar blips or background noise. They were tracked contacts, logged in real time, and actively monitored as Scorpion moved through the area. None of this appeared in any public timeline released for more than 5 decades. One memorandum stood out immediately. It referenced non-cooperative submerged traffic, operating without transponder identification. This was not vague language. During the Cold War, that phrase was reserved for foreign military assets refusing identification, most often Soviet submarines running silent. Yet this wording never appeared in the Court of Inquiry, the Naval Ordnance Laboratory report, or any public summary. The language existed, but it was stripped from the record before the record was shown. Then came the radio logs. Within hours of Scorpion's disappearance, there was a documented surge in encrypted naval traffic. But this traffic did not align with search and rescue coordination. Instead, it aligned with fleet posture adjustments, threat assessments, and command-level routing changes. Ships were repositioned and patrol patterns shifted. The Navy responded as if reacting to a hostile situation, not a mechanical accident. This reaction was never explained. When independent acoustic analysts were finally allowed to re-examine the SOS-US data referenced in the leaked files, the sequence became impossible to ignore. The recordings showed a sharp, high-energy transient, which is an abrupt spike consistent with an external detonation. Milliseconds later came the unmistakable sound of hull collapse under pressure. This order mattered. Internal explosion theories required the hull to fail first or simultaneously. The data showed the opposite. That sequence changed everything. It reframed the loss of Scorpion from a failure that originated inside the submarine to an event triggered from outside it. And that could explain the reason for silence. An external event meant escalation, confrontation, and consequences that extended far beyond a single submarine. The leak did not claim intent, but it destroyed the idea of isolation. Scorpion was not alone in the water that night, and the Navy had known it along. From that moment forward, the central question collapsed inward. It was no longer about faulty equipment or crew error, but about deliberate omission, about why the Navy worked so hard to ensure the public never asked the most dangerous question of all. Who else was there when the Scorpion went silent? It was way worse than we thought, the horror of the final moments. What finally emerged from the 2025 leak was not a reinterpretation of an accident, but a complete reversal of intent. While the USS Scorpion was publicly described as returning home from a Mediterranean deployment, internal orders showed that her route was quietly altered. On May 20, 1968, Vice Admiral Arnold Shade issued a classified directive diverting Scorpion to conduct surveillance on a Soviet naval task group operating near the Canary Islands. The mission was intelligence collection, not transit. The submarine was ordered into contested water while officially listed as heading home. The task force she was sent to monitor included a Soviet Echo 2 class submarine, a platform designed to hunt and kill enemy subs, not evade them. This detail had been buried in plain sight for decades, hidden behind vague route descriptions and sanitized deployment summaries. In this context, Scorpion did not vanish randomly. She disappeared while tailing an armed adversary that knew it was being watched. The 2025 documents went further. They tied Scorpion's loss to a retaliatory pattern that had never been acknowledged publicly. Just weeks earlier, the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-129 had been lost under suspicious circumstances in the Pacific. Internally, U.S. analysts feared escalation. The newly surfaced files suggest that Soviet command authorized a silent response, not through diplomacy, but underwater. The Echo 2 was not avoiding Scorpion, but was hunting her. Acoustic data revisited in light of this context took on new meaning. The initiating shock recorded by SOSUS matched the profile of an external weapon detonation, not an internal failure. The milliseconds that followed were not confusion, but collapse. The hull began to fail as the boat lost depth control. Reactor scrams were attempted, ballast systems were engaged. None of it was enough. Leaked telemetry and internal summaries indicated the crew did not die instantly. There was a brief window where the submarine remained partially intact, descending while systems failed one by one. The men inside would have known what had happened. They would have heard the impact and felt the boat lose control, and they would have understood in the dark that they were no longer alone. One 1968 intelligence memo, suppressed for decades, confirmed that U.S. naval intelligence tracked the Soviet Echo 2 leaving the area immediately after Scorpion went silent. The movement was logged, classified, and sealed. High Command knew within hours that an enemy submarine had been present at the moment of loss. The choice that followed was not confusion, but containment. Families were told it was a mechanical failure, and reports were written to avoid escalation language. Evidence was segmented, delayed, and buried. The Cold War did not erupt because the truth never surfaced. 99 men died in an undeclared engagement, and their deaths were rewritten to preserve strategic balance. What made it worse was not just that Scorpion was sunk, it was that everyone who needed to know did know and chose silence. How and why the truth was buried. The truth did not disappear by accident. It was sealed deliberately, starting within hours of the Scorpion going silent. Former radio operators at the Norfolk Communications Center later described a sudden lockdown that made no sense for a routine submarine loss. Normal logging procedures were halted. Certain message headers were no longer typed or recorded, but passed verbally, ensuring there would be no paper trail to audit later. Communications traffic that should have been routed to Search and Rescue Command was instead redirected through restricted intelligence channels. That single decision revealed the priority. The Navy was no longer focused on finding the submarine. It was focused on managing what the loss meant. Rescue assumes uncertainty, but intelligence routing assumes awareness of a hostile context that must be isolated. Operators recalled being instructed not to annotate timestamps, not to cross-reference transmissions, and not to seek clarification on conflicting signals. These were not efficiency measures. They were deviations justified under the phrase strategic necessity. That phrase appeared repeatedly in internal correspondence, later exposed in the 2025 leak, tying first-hand testimony to documented decisions. What made the suppression endure was not just fear of the Soviet Union, but fear of exposure at home. Admitting that Scorpion had been diverted into contested waters, shadowing a Soviet task force without full situational control, would have revealed a catastrophic intelligence and command failure. Careers would have ended, and doctrine would have been questioned. The Navy's image of technical superiority would have fractured. More than that, acknowledgement of hostile contact carried legal and doctrinal consequences. Under Cold War rules, confirmation that an American nuclear submarine had been sunk by an enemy demanded response. Retaliation risked escalation, and escalation risked war. Silence became the cheaper option. The cover story framed the loss as mechanical because machines do not provoke retaliation, and accidents do not demand answers. Families could grieve without asking who fired first, and the public could move on without realizing how close the Cold War became hot. What was buried was not just evidence, but responsibility. 99 men were lost, and their deaths were rewritten as a mystery to preserve strategic balance. The decision was calculated, and the truth was deemed more dangerous than the lie, and that is what made it worse than anyone was ever told. The pattern that made it worse than we thought. The Scorpion's disappearance was not a solitary tragedy. It was part of a hidden pattern that, if recognized at the time, would have shattered public confidence in the Cold War's underwater balance. In 1968 alone, 4 submarines vanished or suffered catastrophic events under mysterious circumstances. The Israeli INS Dakar, the French Minerve, the Soviet K-129, and the US Scorpion. Each was investigated in isolation, ensuring that the similarities, timing, location, and operational secrecy remained invisible to analysts and the public alike. What looks like coincidence in reports was intentional compartmentalization. The US Navy's own nuclear fleet had seen disaster before. Thresher had already set the precedent of extreme loss, yet lessons from structural integrity and accident response were buried alongside the men. Scorpion's sudden vanishing echoed those warnings, but with the Cold War stakes, acknowledging hostile action, either accidental or deliberate, was a line commanders were forbidden to cross. Admission of such a failure would have forced retaliation, escalation, or exposed gaps in deterrence strategy. Internal decision-making favored strategic stability over transparency at every turn. The official narrative emphasized mechanical mystery, accidents, and human error, while contradictory evidence, acoustic anomalies, and unexplained contacts were locked behind classification walls. Families received explanations that soothed grief but avoided truth, maintaining silence as policy. The ocean floor itself became an instrument of concealment. Wreckage, evidence of hostile engagement, and the record of 99 final moments were all swallowed by depth and secrecy. The abyss became both tomb and archive, storing not only the dead, but the proof that their deaths had been deliberately reframed. What made it worse than anyone realized was the conscious decision to let this pattern go unrecognized. Scorpion's crew was abandoned not by chance, but by policy. Their deaths were managed to prevent geopolitical fallout, and their final struggle was a race to protect a fragile balance of deterrence. The Scorpion was more than a submarine lost to the sea. It was a signal that, in the Cold War, truth was negotiable, and even the lives of 99 men could be sacrificed to preserve the illusion of control. The revelation in 2025 confirmed it. What the world was told was far from reality, and it was way worse than anyone had imagined.